Well, in this video, what we want to do is we want to talk about the skin or the integumentary system. And we're going to break it up into two parts. The first part here we're going to talk about in this video is basically the layers of the skin, the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous tissue below that. In a subsequent video, what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about what I call the skin appendages, which are basically hair follicles, sebaceous glands, sweat glands, fingernails, toenails, and stuff like that. Talk to you about that in the second video. But let's talk first about the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous tissue. Now, I think when we talk about skin, first of all, we have to realize, and this is a question that a lot of other people always ask, what's the largest organ in the body? And they'll say the skin, is the answer. I suppose so, but it's sort of like a trick question, I guess. But yeah, it is. But the skin is really an organ. It has a number of different functions, and we'll talk about some of those functions as time goes on during the course of this video. But it has a lot of different functions. And that, again, when I talk about the integumentary system as a whole, we're not just talking about the skin, but we have our what are called accessory organs or appendages. Hair, nails, various glandular structures such as sweat glands, sebaceous glands or oil glands, as well as embedded in there are various other types of neural receptors or things such as some of those sensory receptors like we talked about before for pain, touch, pressure, stuff like that. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about those in our second video. Okay, so what are those functions? Well, first of all, the skin is a protective barrier. Okay, it works quite well in keeping all bacteria out. In other words, if you're just taking everywhere you go and you touch, you're going to be picking up bacteria and all kinds of other garbage and grit and grime and all kinds of stuff like that. So the idea is to prevent this from entering the body to becoming harmful or pathological. The skin is there to be actually add some protection. I always talk about, if somebody has an open wound, you got to be more careful because then what happens, it's an open portal where things could get in that wound. Therefore, now they get into deeper layers and you've lost that skin protection. Okay, so the skin is really important. When people have burns and they lose a good portion of their skin, the problem is they're much more likely to develop infections in those areas simply because there is no barrier anymore to be able to prevent the bacteria from going hog wild and just taking over the place. So the skin does provide a significant amount of protection, as well as waterproofing, frictional protection, and a number of other factors besides just foreign invaders. Okay, and we'll talk about those as time goes on as well. Skin's also involved in temperature regulation. I think we've talked about in homeostasis before. If my core temperature starts to increase, and again, now we're getting higher than what the body likes, we have to get rid of some of that heat. And the way that we do that is we actually cause a vasodilation. It cause the blood vessels that are just underneath the surface of the skin to dilate. Therefore, they become more full of blood. It brings more warmth to that area, and we're able to evaporate or radiate that heat through the skin, as well as by the fact that we have sweat glands that are all over the surface of the skin, particularly these eccrine sweat glands. They're all over the body, and what happens is they will, with the heat, they'll actually release the sweat. The sweat comes out on the surface of the skin, and by evaporation it cools. Okay, sensation and perception. In other words, due to the number of different types of sensory receptors that are within the skin, basically, it's protective in regards to hot things, sharp things, all kinds of different things. So we're able to feel things, as well as when we talk about the neurological system, touch and stuff like that. That fine tactile sensation is part of these receptors that are in the skin. Excretion. Certain things can be excreted, such as water. Water is commonly excreted through the surface of the body through the skin, besides going out through the respiratory tract and what we exhale, as well as largely through the urinary system. So excretion. Synthesis of vitamin D. Vitamin D is important because it's very important in calcium metabolism. What happens is vitamin D is important in allowing us to be able to absorb more calcium in what we eat. Okay, when we eat something with calcium in, to be able to absorb it through the intestines to get in the bloodstream, as well as decreasing my excretion of calcium through the urine. Okay, so vitamin D is important in keeping that calcium balanced in the body. And again, we talked a little bit before, people think calcium is more important for bone. Well, it's a place where we store the calcium that does make the bone stronger, but we need that calcium for muscle contraction, heart muscle contraction, nerve conduction, and things like that. So we do need that calcium. And one of the things that's important is vitamin D. Well, what does the skin have to do with vitamin D? Sunshine. What happens is vitamin D goes through a metamorphosis through multiple stages. And one stage, what actually stimulates that and pushes along is ultraviolet light. Sunlight will actually cause a conversion of one form of vitamin D to a more active form. So now that active form of vitamin D can be used in the body for helping in trying to keep that calcium levels normal. It's a blood reservoir. In other words, if I need to put some blood somewhere, guess what? Throw it to the skin, because we could actually shunt blood either to or away. If we're cold, we'll shunt the blood away from the skin and into the deeper organs. If we're too warm, we actually shunt blood to the skin. Therefore, we could radiate that heat. Also, certain levels of immunity. There's various areas, there are various cells in the skin that will actually help to provide some level of immune function by resisting infection with bacteria and viruses and stuff like that. So that's, so the skin has a number of functions that more than what we think of, other than being just a pretty face. Okay. Yeah, right. Okay. But anyway, that's a little bit about that. That's a little about skin functions. Now, when we look at the skin comes, like I mentioned, in layers. Okay. And the outer layer is called the epidermis. Epi means upon, okay? The deeper layer is the dermis. So the epidermis is upon the dermis. Makes sense, logical, okay? So our outer layer would be called the epidermis, and there are multiple layers. There's probably 5, at least 4, but very often 5 layers that we find in this epidermis. And that epidermis, if I'm looking at the diagram up in here, the epidermis would be this area in here, okay? Going from this level out, okay? This would be outside the skin out there, okay? And that's the epidermis. The dermis would be actually all this area in here, okay? And the epidermis and dermis are separated by a very thin membrane, and that membrane sits right here. So it's right there, and that's called the basement membrane, the basement membrane, and it separates the epidermis out here from the dermis down there, and that basement membrane separates that. The basement membrane is right there at that lower level of the epidermis. It's really important, because sometimes what happens is wound healing actually will change according to how deep the wound is. If the wound is in the epidermis, these cells in the epidermis regenerate fast in a certain layer, which is the basement layer, or the basal layer, which is right above the basement membrane, okay? And as a result, you heal with no scar. However, if I actually cut down through the epidermis and into the dermis and get down even to the subcutaneous tissue, this outside skin cells that actually replenish themselves by mitosis quite rapidly, I'm deeper than that, and they don't go down inside there. So what happens is they have to heal with scar tissue, and that's a lot of collagen. Remember, we talked about fibroblasts in tissues. These fibroblasts have to go in to try to lay down, because you know what do fibroblasts do? They spit out various filaments and fibers like collagen, okay? So therefore, if we get a cut that's down through the epidermis into the dermis, the fibroblasts come in and they start to spit this material, which results in scar tissue, okay? So that's a little bit about scarring. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the next video. Again, that epidermis, let's just spend some time on the epidermis. Again, the epidermis is classically 5 layers, but sometimes there's one layer that's really not there. Sometimes it's stratum lucidum that we see up in this area right there. Let's get rid of that, right where that blue line is. That area right there, get rid of it, get rid of it. Come on, get rid of it, Jim. Okay, anyway, sometimes that lucidum is not much there. You can't see it a whole lot. And sometimes the granular layer is very difficult to see, but it's there, okay? And what do these epidermal layers contain? They produce, they're made of multiple different types of cells that are embedded in here, but largely what are called keratinocytes, okay, keratinocytes. And the keratinocytes produce a material called keratin. Keratin is that hard, horny material that you get. The surface of the skin are dead keratinocytes. Basically, they get squished down and they die. Okay, and that's what we see. The nails are largely a material called keratin. Hair is some keratin. So those things are these keratinocytes will help to provide sort of like this horny layer of the skin. Melanocytes. Melanocytes are usually in the most basal layer, down in the area that's right close to the basement membrane. if I'm looking down the area right by the basement membrane in here, we're going to find more melanocytes. Okay, and these melanocytes actually produce a pigment called melanin. Melano means black, and this pigment depends upon the number of melanocytes that people have will change the color of or the darkness of the epidermis and the pigment. Okay, we have Langerhans cells. I mentioned that the skin has an effect on the immune system and immune response. And these Langerhans cells will have something to do with that in regards to taking care of things that actually work their way down through the epidermis. What happens is they're able to destroy or cause a process that will destroy a lot of invaders, bacteria and stuff like that. And we also have what are called Merkel cells. Merkel cells assist in tactile stimulation, and they're scattered around through the area of the epidermis. Okay. Now, how does the epidermis work? Epidermis, again, is an epithelial cell. Epithelial cells are coverings and linings. And the thing we know about epithelial cells is they're very tightly packed. They're very closely packed. Okay, so as a result, the blood supply is not that great. It has to get its nutrition by diffusion through one layer to the other. So therefore, the further they get away from that basement membrane, because in the below that where we have the dermis, we have blood vessels. We don't have blood vessels that really get up very much into the epidermis. Okay, and so therefore all the nutrients, the oxygen, stuff like that, has to sort of like leach its way through from that basement membrane all the way through the epidermis. Therefore, the further you get away, those cells start to die after a period of time. They get old and they start to die. However, right down at that basement membrane, we have cells that regenerate. Okay, we'll talk about those in just a second when we go through each individual layer of the epidermis. And what happens is these cells will multiply by mitosis. We've talked about mitosis before, how one cell becomes two, and then another one cell becomes another two, another one cell becomes two. And the rate is relatively quick, so we can actually turn over these cells quite rapidly. If you looked at the chart probably that we had in regards to cell division a while back, it'll show you that chart and how fast these cells will reproduce. Okay, and what happens is right where the basement membrane is, at the deepest layer of the epidermis, these cells are rapidly dividing by mitosis. Okay, and as they start to get, they have to have somewhere to go. So when the cell divides, it pushes the cell above it up a little bit, and that pushes the cell above it up a little bit further, and that pushes the cell above it up a little further until I finally get further and 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 further away from that basement membrane. Okay, and as they get further away from that basement membrane, they start to change. They go through about a couple different changes morphologically, how they look, how they function, and eventually they get to the surface, and basically they're dead cells. They're just flaky stuff that actually flake off that we leave all over the place. Okay, so basically, as these keratinocytes start and they go through these changes, going from the deepest layers to the most superficial layers, they become more keratinized, okay, which means they become more horny or more thick and basically start to become just flaky, dead material, okay? You got to remember that the epidermis is basically squamous cells or relatively flat cells. Okay, that should also be remembered. The epidermis is basically is stratified squamous. If we look at the typical prototype of when we talk about stratified squamous, stratified multiple layers. We talked about that in tissues, and squamous, relatively flat cells. Okay, now that keratin that the keratinocytes will become or produce down the road is basically also provides an outer layer, an outer shell on us for protection as well as waterproofing. And some layers are a little bit more waterproofing than others, and some are a little bit more protection than others. And we'll talk about those individually. So that's what the epidermis basically does. So when we go through these layers, we actually have 5 layers, and sometimes the lucidum we don't see a whole lot. We have what's called the stratum germinativum, okay, or the stratum basale. Now, if I look here, let me just draw. This is where the basement membrane would be. Oh, let me get this. Let me get rid of that big wide thing. Let's go to a smaller pen here. If I look right here, this is where the basement membrane is. So this would be the dermis down here. Everything above here would be epidermis. Okay. This first layer that's right here. Okay. You can see all these lots of cells in there. Okay. And that's called the stratum germinativum or the stratum basale. Basale means base. Germinativum means germinal. Germinal means rapidly producing. Okay. So basically that's what we have that. But above that, in this layer in here, okay? This is called the stratum spinosum. And what happens is cells start to change and they become spiny looking, okay? And that's why they call it the stratum spinosum. The next layer that we have up in here, which is this layer right here, is called the stratum granulosum. They start to develop granules, and as a result, when you look at these are staining a little bit more dark purple. And because what happens, these granules, there's lipid and some other granules inside there, they will stain darker, okay? And also, that's a good waterproofing area, in this area of the stratum granulosum. Above that, this area right here, we get what's called the stratum lucidum. Lucidum means lucency, or where what happens is the cells don't look like the typical. If we look at the cells down here, lower in the area of the basale, the spinosum, and the germinativum, you have nice, good-looking cells. These start to flake out. They start to flatten out. They look like very thin, like a puff pastry or something like that. I mean, they're sort of like more layered. And again, some areas of the body, this layer will be very apparent. Other areas of the body, this layer won't be apparent. Okay, so that's called the stratum lucidum. We'll talk more about these individually. And the outer layer out here is called the stratum corneum. And the stratum corneum is where these keratinocytes have pretty much done their worth. They're actually a protective barrier. They're basically dead cells, and those are the things that we're shedding all the time. Okay, and that's basically that stratum corneum. We're leaving little remnants of ourselves everywhere we go. So let me just go over each of those layers a little bit more in detail. Let's go through that first of all, that stratum germinativum or stratum basale. Okay, and this is the deepest layer of the epidermis. This is where, again, germinativum means germinal. Germinal means it's for regeneration, making more and more and more cells. Again, that basement membrane would be that area right in here, like I drew right there. So this area is a germinativum. What do you see there? If you just look at this image right here, you see lots and lots and lots of cells, and because they're multiplying rapidly by mitosis, we're making more cells. And as we make more cells, we push the next layer up. That pushes the next layer up. That pushes the next layer up. And as it keeps on making a layer up, okay, and going to the outside, this cells will continue to change. So only that deepest layer that's right along that basement membrane down there is called the stratum germinativum or the stratum basale. Okay, either name could be used. They're both appropriate names for that. And that's where the cells are dividing. That's where we're replenishing all these epidermal cells. All the replenishment of the epidermal cells occurring out here. We stop doing that as I get closer to the surface of the skin. The next layer is called the stratum spinosum, and that's this area in here. This area in here is called the stratum spinosum, okay? And basically what happens is the cells start to change in shape, and they become more spiny. They have like little spines on them when they look at them under a real high power. And what happens is they do provide from some skin strength, because these little spines sort of like stick to the other ones and other cells in the stratum spinosum, the spiny areas, and basically so they do stick together. So it does provide some strength as well as flexibility. So it allows a little flexibility and some twist. We want the skin to be pliable. You don't want the skin to be too hard. You want it to be pliable, and that's the spinosum will help with that. The next layer up there was that germinativum the granulosum that we talked about before. And this is the granulosum layer right here. And what happens is you do see these become staining a little bit different. They're staining a little bit darker purple, by the stain that they have on there. And that's because of all these granules inside. Inside the cytoplasm, there'll be lots of these granules, and these granules have lipids and stuff like that. And because of the lipid nature of the area of the stratum granulosum, it provides a waterproofing. So as a result, it becomes almost like a waterproof or a waterproof barrier. When we talked about the cell membrane, we talked about that lipid bilayer, and the lipid bilayer was good because it kept the water outside the cell separate from the water inside the cell, because again, it's a waterproofing type of a thing. And we see the same thing here with the stratum granulosum. The next layer up we have is the stratum lucidum, and this is the stratum lucidum layer in here. It's a clearer layer. The cells aren't really looking very much like cells anymore, and basically it's only in the areas where we can see it regularly, where the skin is thicker, like in the palms and the soles. And what it does is it does a couple things. It improves the elasticity of the skin as well as the stretch. Now this becomes important if you think about the palms and you think about the soles, where you see this a very thick stratum lucidum layer. The thing about it is they're constantly under friction. As we walk, our foot's actually sliding forward in our shoe, and as a result, it creates a lot of friction between the skin layers, and some of that friction is taken up in that area of the stratum lucidum. It allows it to move in like a horizontal. I can't how to do. There we go. Moving a horizontal plate. Okay. Like that. Okay, that was hard. Okay, well, anyway, it allows that to happen. So it provides some elasticity and stretch to the skin that actually protects the skin a little bit more. So it lowers the effect of the friction. Therefore, it's very beneficial in the areas where we have thicker skin. Why that thicker skin is there for more protection, such as the palms and soles. Okay, it doesn't always work that way. In other words, sometimes things fail when we get blisters, and blisters are actually a separation. When we get a blister, that separation of the blister is usually sometimes between the dermis and the epidermis at that basement membrane layer. Okay, and you know, we actually pull out a lot of that epidermis. Sometimes it's actually through the area of the stratum lucidum as well. So, and then fluid will collect in there, which is basically that blister fluid, which is like the plasma of blood. It's very similar to plasma of blood. Okay, but anyway, that's a little bit beside the point. So that's called the stratum lucidum. The outer layer on the outside is called the stratum corneum. So this area out here is the stratum corneum, and these are dead horny cells. Okay, these are cells that have been keratinized. They're sort of like flaky. They're just cells. They're really not. They're not alive. They're just there. If you could, if we were in the laboratory, I could actually have you take a side of a slide, and if you scrape the side of your skin, okay, you take. Take the skin and just scrape it and scrape it onto another slide. You see all these little white flaky things come off, and those are just pieces of the stratum corneum, the cells, the keratinocytes that are dead. Okay, and basically they fall onto a slide. When they actually look for various skin fungus, they could actually take a skin scraping. Okay, and what happens is they'll actually take a little bit of potassium hydroxide, which is a base material, and put a drop of potassium hydroxide, and it actually destroys the corneum. It like eats it. It dissolves it. So all you have left are the fungal spores and stuff like that, fungus and yeast. You see these little spores sitting on little branches. So, but anyway, that's the stratum corneum. It's the outer horny dead cells that are out there. We slough them all the time. We're always removing them so the skin doesn't get thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker. And this does provide that. And again, some places it's thicker. You notice over areas of pressure and friction that will also get thicker. Okay, or where there's a lot of weight on a certain area, it will cause that to get thicker, because what it does create a protection barrier for things like infection. The thicker the corneum is, the more protection there is to get. It has the bacteria and stuff have to go further distance to get down to the deeper layers where they actually get to blood vessels. Because again, you got to remember, epidermis avascular, doesn't really have blood vessels. Okay, all the blood vessels we find are below that in the dermis. Okay, it also prevents dehydration. In other words, it's sort of like provides that barrier so that the water can't get out very easily, unless we have too much, then we could get rid of it. Okay, but it can't get the water out. If you look at people who are dehydrated, okay, if you look at people who are dehydrated, if you know someone like an old person, don't go into any nursing homes doing this or anything like that. You'll probably get arrested. But what happens, especially now with COVID-19, I mean, you should stay away from stuff like that. But what happens, if you look at sometimes people who are dehydrated or people who are elderly, when they lose that skin elasticity, if you take their skin and you just pinch it and you pull it up like that, okay, it should normally just fall right back down. But what happens if there's dehydration, the skin actually stays up in like a tent and very slowly goes down back to flat. It takes a long time. And so the skin is actually a barrier to prevent dehydration. Okay. Also, it's a barrier, or the stratum corneum, and also the stratum corneum is a barrier for things like chemical and mechanical stress. Again, shear stress, pressure, stuff like that, as well as different types of materials. I say chemical, but that could be anything. It could be a juice from a juice box. I don't know. You know, anything that's chemical, it prevents it from getting in deeper. So it's a barrier there. And the stratum corneum, the thickness of the stratum corneum, does that. Now, so let's just look at this again. This is just another great picture. The one on the left is probably a lot better. And basically, if you look here, this whole area right here is a stratum corneum. So it's actually quite thick. These are all dead cells. You see how there's not much, you can't see much going on there. It looks pretty dead. If you look here, this is a very great picture of the lucidum. Sits right in here. See how light it is? You know, and that's what we see in that lucidum layer. I'm assuming that most likely this is probably either on the palms or the soles, because again, you see a very prominent lucidum layer. Here's my granulosum layer. Okay, if I look at different color, here's my granulosum layer right here, where we have a lot of those granules and that lipid granules that are inside that and that's the granulosum layer. It sits in there. The spinosum layer we see down in here. This area is all the spinosum, where the cells are changing, they're becoming more spiny. And then finally, if you look down at the deepest most portion down in here, you see where there's a lot of cells that are all along here. You see a lot more dots. Those are a lot, because that's the cells, and that's in that germinativum or basale layer. And the basement membrane here would be right here. And you know what I'm talking about. You could follow that all the way, so you could draw the rest, okay? That's my basement membrane. So all this up here is epidermis. All this down here would be dermis. Okay, and basically that's the difference between the two. If we look on the right, those layers aren't nearly as prominent. I don't see a lucidum there. I don't see, and the germinativum is really not very prominent. Here's the corneum out here. This would be the germinativum or the basale layer right there. The granulosum I can't really see a whole lot. Here's the spinosum layer in here. So anyway, that's just a different area. This is all dermis down here. This here, everything that's purple is the epidermis. Everything that's pink is dermis. Okay. Now the dermis is the area of connective tissue that's under the epidermis. Okay. It has two parts to it. One part's called papillary and the other part's called reticular. Papillary means papilla. Papilla means a bump. Okay. So when we look at this area right there, that's a papillary dermis, papillary dermis, papillary dermis. This area down here would be reticular. This area would be papillary, 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 reticular. Okay, so these are the papillary versus reticular areas. Now that papillary region, and here's the papillary region. Here's the papillary region here. Papillary region. So this would be reticular. This is all papillary, papillary, papillary here. It's the outer probably fifth, and it's going to differ according to where we are in the body. And basically this is areolar connective tissue. So it's relatively loose, some elastic fibers that are in there, okay? And these dermal papillae actually are what create the ridges that we see on the fingers and the toes, which are basically the fingerprints. And these little ridges actually cause a little bit of a change in the, well, actually what we see here, this area right here would be the germinativum layer. This is all the lucidum. This is the granulosum layer that you can actually see right in here. This area right here where it's a little bit gappy would be the lucidum, and stratum corneum would be out in there, so you could actually see that. And so therefore this is probably on, because we do see a good lucidum, okay, that's probably in the palms or the soles or on the fingertips or something like that. And because of all these little ridges that are in the skin, those papillary ridges, is that's what actually provides the fingerprints. And the reason why we have fingerprints is it does create, instead of being the fingers being really slippery and smooth, it does provide a little bit of a grit. Okay, so as a result, it allows us to allows a little bit of a frictional surface in regards to holding. Okay, one other thing we talked about before when we talked about some of the other in the tissues is this area right here is a Meissner's corpuscle, which is basically a sensory nerve ending. And that sensory nerve ending is an area that's encapsulated. It's an encapsulated nerve ending which detects pressure. Okay, so that'd be called Meissner's corpuscle, which we talked about before. But that's just looking at the dermis there. Okay, again, looking at the dermis, here we go. This is the reticular portion. So if I look up in here, this little area up here, the lumpy, bumpy area, that'd be the papillary region. Okay, up in there, and then all this down here would be reticular, all the way down to about here would be the reticular. It's more of a dense, irregular connective tissue. We talked about it's dense. With what do we mean by dense? Those fibers are tightly packed. Loose, they're loosely packed. Dense, those fibers are densely or tightly packed. And irregular, because what happens is they go in multiple different directions. It's woven all over the place as compared to parallel lines like we saw with tendon and ligament. Okay, so these are sort of like woven, they're all together and they're in a bunch of different directions. What that does, it provides a nice tough base, that area. So that provides a nice tough base for the area of the reticular dermis. Also, what's inside the reticular dermis is the many of the appendages, like I talked about before. Adipose glands, adipose, which would be some fat. Okay, hair, follicles, oil and sweat glands, are all embedded. Like here's a hair follicle right here. Here are some sebaceous glands or oil glands. We'll have other types of sweat glands. That's an eccrine sweat gland that will be there, a representation of it, an eccrine sweat gland. So all these extra appendages basically have their roots in the area. That's a bad word, roots. That was a bad choice of word. Have their origin or their basis in the area of the reticular dermis. Okay. There are also what are called Pacinian corpuscles, which are also mechanoreceptors that are deeper inside there. Again, we have those Meissner's corpuscles. They're usually in the papillary region, but deeper on down, we'll have other types of what are called Pacinian corpuscles, which are also mechanical receptors, which measure deeper pressure or deeper touch sensation. Okay, so that's what we see in the reticular portion of the dermis. Papillary dermis, the area that's up in here, and these little lumps and bumps, and the reticular portion is this area that's down here, which is the majority of the dermis, where most of the origins or the basis of all those skin appendages would be. Okay, now I'm going back to the same pictures I had before, okay, just to show you, again, this is the epidermis like we talked about before, and once I get down below that, I'm down the dermis. So these areas right in here, that's the papillary. You can see a Meissner's corpuscle right there. Papillary dermis sitting down in here. I call the dermal papillae, okay, sitting in here. So this area right here would be the papillary dermis, and then this down here would be the reticular dermis, okay. Same thing, this is the papillary regions in here. It comes down to here, and this would be reticular down here. This is papillary up in here, there. That's the papillary. All this down here would be reticular, okay. So that's just the difference between those two. Subcutaneous layer. The subcutaneous layer is also called the superficial fascia or hypodermis, and basically what it is, it's largely comprised of a lot of adipose. A lot of fat sits down in there. A lot of that fat, wrong one. Okay, a lot of the fat that we get is actually deposited in that subcutaneous layer, that subcutaneous fat, and a lot of loose connective tissue that holds the fat together. Okay, what's the function of the subcutaneous layer? It stores water and fat. Okay, we talked a little about fat before. It does provide some padding, and we do find that the padding does vary according to age. Okay, it does vary according to sex. Some of that has to be, believe it, just to take you a little bit deeper into this. The padding that we get in females, the different body posture that we get in females, and where the fat is deposited in females is largely under the influence of something called the big E, estrogen. Estrogen actually deposits the fat in certain areas. In fact, what they talk about is, this is sort of cool. There's a very close association between estrogen and fat in females. And what happens is females who are like heavy duty runners, who are running, miles and miles and miles, and they have very low body fat. When they finally get to a very low body fat, what happens is it actually messes up their estrogen levels. Okay, and these are some of the females that are what are called amenorrheic. They don't have any menses simply because their estrogen levels are so low. And the estrogen is important in building the inside lining of the uterus to be able to provide for implantation of an ovum should there be fertilization. And at the end of the month, if there's no fertilization and if there's no implantation, that inside lining, or that endometrium, endo within metrium means uterus, the endometrial wall sloughs off and is expelled as menses. Okay, and so basically females with low body fat don't deposit they don't store a lot of fat, and that fat being closely associated with estrogen, these females are also amenorrheic as well. They don't have any menses because the estrogen levels are exceptionally low. We know that adipose is also important in insulation, does provide a barrier for heat loss and stuff like that. Also, it's an area for blood vessel and nerve pathways. So fat is very bloody. If you look at fat, there's a lot of blood vessels in there. Not many really big vessels, but a lot of small vessels all over the place. And basically, it's a way for blood vessels to get out to different layers of the body through the fat. Okay, so basically that's that subcutaneous layer that provides all those things. Okay, again, like I mentioned before, all skin's not the same. Some skin is going to be a lot different. Depends upon the area of the body, and in the different areas of the body, the skin thickness is going to be different. Okay, they looked up here at shoulder, scalp, and palm, and what happens is if we look, I guess the shoulder here, scalp here, and palm down here, you can see a very thick area of stratum corneum in the area of the palms, which would be in this area. Okay, so basically, where I need more thickness, the body gives it by having a thickness of the layers of the skin, the epidermis. Okay. Also, what happens is depends upon the need for other accessory organs or skin appendages as to how thick the epidermis is and how abundant the dermis is. Because again, the origin or the basis of most of these accessory organs, the hair, the sweat glands, and stuff like that, are based in the dermis, not in the epidermis. Epidermis is only squamous cells. All the sweat glands have to pass through the epidermis. All the hair follicles start in the dermis and they come up through the epidermis. Okay, so all these, so that will, depending upon what the need is in the various part of the body, the skin will be different. Okay, it will be different in layers and stuff like that. Now, a couple things that we mentioned this a little bit before about skin color. Skin color basically can be influenced by a number of factors. Okay, the most prominent one is the melanin, and that melanin is at the basement layers. The germinativum basale layers. There'll be small pigment particles will be down there, and that's called melanin. They're dark. Melano means black. Okay, so these are darkish black to brown, and they're made from tyrosine by what are called melanocytes. Melanin cytes cell. Okay, and they make these brownish blackish pigments called or particles that are called melanin. Obviously, the more melanin that's in there, the greater the number of melanocytes. There's more melanin. The darker the skin will appear. Keratin also can cause a change in the skin. This is usually a little bit more different in other people with other types of problems and may cause a yellowish color. Now, that's not the jaundice that we talk about. We'll talk about jaundice when we get to the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, that's not what we see there. But this keratin is actually a precursor of vitamin A. It's not really much of a problem. And hemoglobin would give it a reddish color, and so the skin gets a pink color because of the blood vessels in the dermis. And almost, I can't say this, that the epidermis is transparent. It's not, but there is some level of translucency to it. Okay, and so that's what we have with skin color. So what we've talked about in this video is basically just looking at the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous tissue, layers of each, the importance and the function of each, and hopefully they'll give you a little bit better idea as to what the skin is all about. Skin is exceptionally important simply because it does provide a number of significant functions, like we talked at the very beginning: protection, waterproofing, all kinds of different things. Okay, vitamin D production, all kinds of things. They're all involved with the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous tissue, and that's what we talked about in this video. So hopefully this has given you a little bit more information about what the skin is. What we're going to do is we'll have another video that'll come up after this one in regards to skin appendages such as hair follicles, sebaceous gland, which are oil glands, sediferous glands, which are basically sweat glands, and things like that, and also a few things about receptors, sensory receptors that are in the skin. So if you have any questions, obviously, as in all, you can always email me, ask me the questions during a conference, or look it up. I mean, I like to talk about it if you get a chance. But anyway, I said, other than that, my recommendation is to be safe and be healthy, and we'll see you at our next video.